My cousin Sophie had stolen 6 boyfriends from me, so I finally gave her exactly what she wanted. I sent her one photograph of the man she'd been chasing for months, and she fell for it without asking a single question. I want to be clear about the number, because for years my family treated it like an exaggeration I'd invented to make myself sound more wronged than I actually was.
6.
Not 2, not a couple of unfortunate coincidences, 6 separate boyfriends, spanning 9 years, each one drawn away from me by the same cousin, in front of the same family, who each time found a new reason to explain it wasn't really her fault. The first one, when we were 19, my mother called just a phase, cousins get competitive. The fourth one, my aunt called an accident of proximity, you two just have similar taste. By the 6th one, 3 years ago, nobody in my family bothered explaining it at all anymore. They simply stopped mentioning it, the way you stop mentioning a leak in the ceiling once you've decided fixing it costs more than living with a stain. If you've ever been told your own pattern recognition was the actual problem, stay. Subscribe to Eternal Novel now, because Sophie has no idea yet that the photograph I just sent her isn't a coincidence at all. I stopped bringing boyfriends to family gatherings after the 6th one. It felt safer than watching, in real time, my cousin's particular gift for making herself irresistibly available to exactly the men I'd made the mistake of caring about. I told myself I'd made peace with it. I told myself a lot of things, most of them lies I needed in order to keep showing up to Sunday dinners without screaming. Then Sophie got engaged. Marcus was, by every account I trusted, a genuinely decent man, steady, kind, visibly smitten with her in a way that made even my most cynical relatives soften. I liked him. That was the complicated part one hadn't planned for. I wasn't plotting against Marcus. I was plotting against a pattern, and Marcus, without knowing it, had simply wandered into the blast radius of 9 years of accumulated proof my family had refused to look at directly. So when Sophie mentioned, 3 weeks before her engagement party, that she'd noticed someone new following me on social media, an interesting-looking man named Julian, charming in his photos, clearly close to me in a way she couldn't quite place, I understood, with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, exactly what I was finally going to do about all of it. Julian Ferris wasn't actually close to me at all.
Not yet.
He was an old acquaintance from a mutual friend's wedding 2 years earlier, memorable mostly because of one detail I hadn't fully appreciated until I needed it. He'd once dated Sophie himself, briefly, back in college, before she'd left him for someone else the week his grandmother died, a detail he'd mentioned once, in passing, with the specific flatness of a wound that had never fully closed. I found his number through the mutual friend and called him with a proposal I'd rehearsed twice in my car before I could make myself say it out loud. "This is going to sound strange," I said, once the small talk ran out. "I need someone to pretend to be interested in me."
Publicly.
On social media, at a few family events. Someone my cousin would find impossible to resist trying to take.
There was a long pause on a line.
"Is this about Sophie Hendricks? You remember her." "I remember exactly 1 week in college I've spent 6 years trying not to think about," he said, something sharpening in his voice. "What did she do to you?" I told him. All 6, in order, the years of family minimization stacked on top of each other like sediment. By the time I finished, his voice had gone quiet in a way that told me I'd found someone who understood the particular exhaustion of being disbelieved by people who were supposed to protect you. "I'm in," he said. "Not because I'm still angry about what happened in college. Because I've watched my own sister get gaslit by a family that decided believing her would be too inconvenient, and I know exactly what it costs a person to keep swallowing that. What do you need me to do?" The plan, once we built it together over the following week, was simpler than either of us expected it to be. Sophie's pattern had never required elaborate manipulation on our part. It required only opportunity, the specific, narrow window she'd exploited 6 times before, the moment she noticed someone paying attention to me and decided, apparently without ever fully examining why, that she needed to prove she could take it. We staged the appearance of a relationship carefully, photos from a real dinner we actually had, at a restaurant close enough to where Sophie's friends gathered that word would travel, a handful of comments on my social media posts calibrated to look exactly like early, hopeful interest instead of performance. I didn't fabricate anything that would collapse under scrutiny. I simply created the one condition Sophie had reliably responded to for 9 years and waited to see whether the pattern my family insisted didn't exist would show up on its own. It took 4 days. Sophie texted me on a Tuesday night, breezy and casual in a way that had, over the years, become its own kind of warning sign. "Who's the guy in your pictures? He's cute. You've been holding out on me." I stared at that message for a long time before I answered, feeling something settle into place that was less like anger and more like the particular calm of watching a theory finally confirm itself in real time. "His name's Julian," I wrote back. "We're still figuring things out. Nothing's serious yet." Her reply came almost instantly, 3 words that told me everything I needed to know about how little 6 repetitions had taught her to resist the exact same impulse. "Send me a picture." I sent the photograph that night, a clear shot of Julian's face taken at the restaurant. Good lighting, nothing staged looking about it. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time afterward, watching the 3 dots appear and disappear twice before Sophie finally responded.
Wow.
"He's gorgeous. Where did you even meet someone like that?" I told myself, reading it, that I felt nothing but cold, useful clarity. That wasn't entirely true. Some smaller, more honest part of me still hoped, even after 6 times, that this message would be different. That Sophie would simply say something kind and leave it there, and I would have built an elaborate trap for nothing, and I'd be relieved instead of vindicated. She didn't leave it there. Within a week, she'd found a reason to run into Julian at a coffee shop 2 blocks from his office, a location she had no reasonable excuse to be near, and mentioned it to me afterward with the exact same practiced casualness she'd used the first 5 times. "Small world," she said over the phone, laughing. "I literally just bumped into Julian getting coffee. He's even more charming in person. You have to bring him to the engagement party." I felt something in my chest go very still and very focused. "You want me to bring him to your engagement party?" Of course. Marcus would love to meet him. And honestly, it'd be nice to actually get to know the guy who's made you disappear off social media for 2 weeks straight. A pause, just slightly too calculated to be careless. "Is he seeing anyone else, do you know? He mentioned something about being not really tied down yet when we talked." I closed my eyes. 9 years, 6 men, and here was the 7th conversation, arriving exactly on schedule, dressed in the same casual cruelty as everyone before it. "I'll ask him if he wants to come," I said, keeping my voice level.
No promises.
Julian, when I called him afterward, wasn't remotely surprised. "She asked if I was single within a week of seeing your photos," he said. "That's not subtlety, Daphne. That's a woman who's never once had to develop subtlety because nobody in her orbit has ever made her need it." "She invited me to bring you to her engagement party," I said. "To meet Marcus." The line went quiet for a moment. That's either the boldest thing I've ever heard, or she genuinely doesn't understand what she's doing while she's doing it. "I don't think she's ever had to understand it," I said slowly, working through something that had been forming at the edges of my thinking for days. "That's the part my family's never wanted to look at directly. It's not that she's some calculating villain plotting against me specifically. It's that she's never once faced a consequence sharp enough to teach her the behavior was actually costing her something. Every single time, someone in my family found a softer word for it before it could land." "So what happens at this party?" Julian said. "If we actually go?" I thought about Marcus, steady and kind, 3 weeks from marrying a woman he had no reason to distrust. I thought about my aunt, who would find some new explanation ready before the evening even ended, the way she always did. I thought about 9 years of quietly absorbing the same wound and calling it a family quirk because naming it plainly had never once been allowed. "We go," I said. "And this time, I'm not going to let anyone soften what happens." 6 times, softened. 6 times, excused. This time, she's walking straight into an engagement party with no idea what's waiting for her. Subscribe to Eternal Novel so you're here when the trap finally closes. I want to be honest about something before I describe the engagement party, because I think it matters to the rest of the story. I almost called it off twice in the week leading up to it. The first time was watching Marcus, at a family barbecue, describe with genuine, unguarded happiness the way Sophie had helped his mother through a difficult diagnosis earlier that year, patient and warm in a way that had nothing to do with performance. I sat there with my drink going warm in my hand, wondering whether I was about to detonate something real and good over a pattern that might, this once, actually stay dormant. The second time was my own mother, calling to ask, with unusual gentleness, whether I was doing okay with the wedding coming up, whether it was hard watching Sophie get her happy ending. I almost told her everything then. I didn't, because some tired, calculating part of me already knew that telling her before I had proof would simply become the seventh soft explanation, and I would spend the rest of my life being the cousin who couldn't be happy for anyone. The party was at a rented event space downtown, string lights and a jazz quartet and 40 family members drinking champagne under an arrangement of White Orchid. Sophie had clearly spent months planning. Julian arrived exactly on time, in a suit that made three separate aunts visibly reconsider whatever they'd been discussing, and found me near the bar with the easy, practiced warmth of someone who had, admittedly, done a small amount of acting in college. "Showtime," he murmured, low enough that only I could hear it. Sophie found us within 20 minutes, radiant in a green dress, Marcus's arm looped through hers in a way that looked, infuriatingly, completely genuine. "You actually came," she said to Julian, her smile sharpening into something I recognized instantly from 6 previous performances. "I was starting to think Daphne was keeping you locked away on purpose." "Couldn't miss the engagement party of someone Daphne talks about so much," Julian said smoothly, and I watched Sophie's eyes do the specific, familiar thing they always did, a flicker of assessment, quick and automatic, checking whether the man in front of her was worth the trouble of taking. Marcus, to his credit, seemed to notice nothing beyond ordinary social pleasantries, shaking Julian's hand warmly, asking easy questions about his work, entirely unaware that his fiancée had just recalibrated her entire evening around a man his own cousin-in-law had brought as a date. It happened faster than even I expected. Within the hour, I watched Sophie maneuver Julian toward the dance floor under the thin pretext of introducing him to a business contact who turned out, conveniently, to have already left. I watched her hand rest against his arm a beat longer than the song required. I watched her lean in to say something close enough to his ear that from across the room, to anyone not specifically watching for it, it might have read as simple friendliness. Julian, playing his part with more precision than I'd given him credit for, let her get close enough to reveal exactly what we needed, and not 1 inch closer than that. When she asked, quietly, whether he wanted to step outside, to actually talk away from all this noise, he glanced once, deliberately, toward the small camera clipped discreetly to the string light rigging above the dance floor, a camera Sophie's own wedding photographer had installed that afternoon to capture candid moments for the album, and one I had quietly arranged, through a conversation with that photographer 2 days earlier, to keep running the entire evening instead of only during the toasts. "Actually," Julian said, loud enough this time for the nearest cluster of family members to hear clearly, "I think we should probably stay in here." Marcus seems like he'd want to know where his fiancée wandered off to during her own engagement party. Sophie's smile faltered for the first time all night, and across the room, I saw my aunt's head turn sharply toward us, the particular alertness of a woman sensing, for the first time in 9 years, that the story she'd always told herself about her daughter might not survive the evening intact. Sophie recovered fast. She always had. That was part of what had let this pattern survive 9 years undisturbed. By the time she rejoined the party, she'd already reframed the entire moment into something almost charmingly innocent, laughing it off to the small cluster of relatives nearby as just checking whether Daphne's new guy could actually hold a conversation before I fully approve, a line delivered with enough easy warmth that I watched 2 aunts nod along, already halfway to forgetting what they'd just witnessed. I said nothing that night. I'd learned, across 9 years of watching this exact recovery happen 5 times before, that confronting Sophie in the moment only ever gave her room to perform contrition convincingly enough to reset the narrative in her favor. I needed something she couldn't perform her way out of. It arrived at 1:47 in the morning, in the form of a text forwarded to me from Julian, 3 words of commentary attached above a screenshot that made my stomach drop even though I'd built this entire trap specifically hoping for exactly this outcome. She just texted me this. The screenshot showed Sophie's message, sent from her own number, time-stamped less than an hour after she'd walked back into her own engagement party pretending nothing had happened. "Sorry about tonight. Things got weird with all those people around. Can we actually talk properly sometime? Somewhere quieter. I feel like there's something real here, and I don't want Marcus's party to be the reason we don't explore it." I read it 4 times, the specific vertigo of watching a theory become undeniable evidence settling into something heavier than satisfaction. This wasn't ambiguous. This wasn't a dance floor moment that could be explained away as friendliness misread by a jealous cousin. This was a woman, 3 weeks from her own wedding, in writing, actively pursuing the man her cousin had supposedly just started dating. I don't want to use this to humiliate her publicly, I told Julian on the phone the next morning, surprising myself with how much I meant it. I know that probably sounds strange, given everything I asked you to help me set up. It doesn't sound strange, he said. It sounds like the difference between wanting the truth to exist and wanting to watch someone burn for it. Those aren't the same thing, even if people expect them to be. I want my family to finally see it, I said slowly, working it out loud as I said it. Not a viral moment. Not a scene at her wedding. I want my aunt, specifically, to look at proof she can't reframe into something softer, and I want her to have to sit with that before anyone else gets involved. Julian was quiet for a moment. And Marcus? That question sat heavier than any other part of this. He deserves to know before he marries her, I said. Whatever happens to my family because of this, he deserves that much before it's too late to matter. I called my aunt that afternoon and asked her to meet me alone, no explanation beyond needing to talk about something important. She arrived at my apartment 2 hours later, already visibly braced for something, the particular tension of a woman who has spent years anticipating a reckoning she hoped would never actually come. I didn't ease into it. I'd spent 9 years watching soft approaches get absorbed and reframed into nothing. I set my phone on the table between us, the screenshot already open, and said the only sentence I'd rehearsed. I need you to actually look at this one, before you decide it's another misunderstanding. 9 years of soft explanations, and now she's holding proof her mother can't reframe away. Comment what you think happens next, and subscribe to Eternal Novel, so you're here when the truth finally makes it to the one person who deserves to hear it most. My aunt read the screenshot twice, her face going through the exact sequence I'd watched it go through 5 times before over the years. First confusion, then the reflexive search for an alternative explanation, then, when none arrived fast enough, something closer to genuine alarm. This could mean anything, she said finally, though her voice had lost the automatic confidence it usually carried in these conversations. Sophie's always been a warm person. Maybe she genuinely just wanted to be friendly with someone she thought was becoming part of the family. Read the words again, I said, keeping my voice level, refusing to let this become the shouting match that would give her an easy reason to dismiss me as simply emotional. Something real here. Not friendliness. Not concern for a future family member. She wrote that to a man she'd known for less than a month, 3 weeks before her own wedding, hours after he'd started dating me. Started dating, my aunt repeated slowly, something shifting behind her eyes. Daphne, how long have you actually known this man? I told her the truth. All of it. The photograph, the staged relationship, the 4 days it took Sophie to ask for a picture, the way I'd built the exact conditions that had worked on her 5 times before and simply waited to see if she'd walk into them a 6th. I watched my aunt's face as I explained it, watched her go through something that looked less like anger at me and more like a woman finally being forced to do arithmetic she'd spent 9 years actively avoiding. You engineered this, she said, when I finished. You deliberately set a trap for your own cousin. I engineered a controlled version of something that's happened to me 6 times without any help from me at all, I said. The only difference this time is that I finally have proof instead of just my own word against her charm. She was quiet for a long time, turning the phone over in her hands like it might offer her a version of this story she could still manage. Why now? She said finally. Why not years ago, when it might have actually protected you from something? Because years ago, I still believed that if I just explained it clearly enough, someone in this family would finally believe me without needing proof, I said, and my voice cracked slightly despite my best effort to keep it steady. It took me a long time to understand that the problem was never that my explanations weren't clear enough. It was that believing me would have required admitting you'd spent years making excuses for her instead. My aunt didn't defend herself against that. I think, more than anything else in the conversation, that silence told me more than any apology could have, the specific, heavy silence of someone finally recognizing a truth they'd spent years successfully avoiding, arriving too late to undo any of what it had already cost. What do you want to do with this? She asked quietly. I want Marcus to know before the wedding, I said. Not as a public spectacle. Just the truth, given to him directly. So, he gets to make his own choice about his own life with actual information instead of whatever version of events Sophie decides to give him. She'll never forgive you for this. She's had 6 chances to be the one who stopped, I said. I'm done being the only person in this family who's supposed to carry the cost of that. My aunt's phone buzzed on the table between us before she could respond, and her face went pale reading whatever appeared on the screen. She turned it toward me slowly, and I read a text from Sophie, sent to the family group chat 12 minutes earlier, already spinning a version of tonight's confrontation before I'd even had the chance to bring it to Marcus myself. Just so everyone knows before rumors start, Daphne set some kind of weird trap with a guy she barely knows to try to make me look bad. I don't know why she's so unhappy about my wedding that she'd do something like this, but I really hope we can all just focus on the happy parts of this week instead of whatever this is. I drove to Marcus's apartment that same evening, before Sophie's version of events could fully calcify into the family's official story, my aunt's silence on the phone behind me feeling less like support and more like a woman who still hadn't decided which version of her daughter she was willing to live with. Marcus opened the door already looking unsettled, his phone in his hand, clearly having seen at least some fragment of the group chat's unfolding chaos. Daphne, what's going on? Sophie's saying you set some kind of trap. I did, I said, before he could build any more of the story out of Sophie's framing. I need 15 minutes, and then whatever you decide to do with what I tell you is entirely up to you. I'm not here to convince you to leave her. I'm here because you deserve to know what you're actually choosing before you marry her, not after. He let me in, and I told him everything, the same unflinching version I'd given my aunt hours earlier. Screenshot included, 6 previous boyfriends named specifically instead of vaguely alluded to. I watched him go through the same sequence I'd now watched twice in one day. Disbelief, the search for an alternative explanation, and finally, when the text message on my phone refused to mean anything other than exactly what it said, something that looked like the floor of his entire relationship quietly giving way beneath him. She told me you'd always been a little jealous of her, he said quietly, staring at the screenshot. That you two had a complicated history, and I shouldn't take anything you said about her too seriously if it ever came up. She's not wrong that we have a complicated history, I said. She's just been the one writing the terms of it for 9 years. I'm not asking you to take my word over hers on that count. I'm giving you the actual message she sent in her own words and letting you decide what that tells you about the rest of it. Marcus sat with the phone for a long time, scrolling slowly through the screenshot like he was hoping a different reading of it might surface, if he looked hard enough. I need to talk to her, he said finally. Not to you, not right now. I need to hear this directly from her, and I need you to understand that whatever happens after that isn't something I'm deciding tonight, in front of you. That's fair, I said, standing to leave. I didn't come here for a verdict tonight, Marcus. I came because I couldn't let you find out after the wedding instead of before it. I found out 3 days later, through my mother, exactly how that conversation had gone. Marcus had confronted Sophie with the screenshot directly, and Sophie, apparently unable to find a version of events that survived contact with her own written words, had eventually admitted, not fully, not without qualification, but enough, that she developed feelings for Julian she hadn't fully examined before acting on them, the same phrase, my mother told me with a kind of exhausted recognition, that Sophie had used for at least 2 of the 5 previous boyfriends whose names had somehow never made it into the family's official version of events. The wedding was postponed within the week. Not cancelled outright, not yet, though I suspected, watching the careful, formal language of the announcement Sophie's mother sent to the extended family, that postponed was simply the word everyone had agreed to use while the actual ending arranged itself, more slowly, out of view. My aunt called me the following Sunday, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. I think I need to actually look at this properly, she said. All of it. Not just tonight's version. I think I've been doing arithmetic wrong for a very long time, and I don't know yet what it looks like to correct 9 years of it, but I'd like to try if you're willing to let me. I didn't have a clean answer for her. I still don't, entirely. But I told her I was willing to try too, because I understood, finally, that the version of justice I actually wanted had never been about watching Sophie burn in public. It had been about anyone in my own family finally choosing to look at the pattern clearly instead of finding one more soft word to bury it under. Sophie didn't speak to me for 4 months. I can't say I blamed her entirely. Even knowing everything I knew, being caught, in writing, 3 weeks before your own wedding, by a trap your own cousin spent weeks building, isn't the kind of humiliation most people recover from gracefully in real time. I heard about her, mostly secondhand, through a family group chat that had gone quieter and more careful than I'd ever known it to be. everyone apparently recalibrating how much they were willing to say out loud now that the family's unspoken rules about Sophie had been so publicly broken. Julian and I talked most days during those months, though not, at first, about anything beyond the aftermath we'd both helped create. He told me, eventually, that confronting Sophie's pattern directly had done something he hadn't expected for his own old wound. The 6-year-old humiliation of losing her the week his grandmother died had always felt, to him, like evidence that he'd simply been disposable to her specifically. Watching the pattern extend across 9 years and 5 other men reframed it into something less personal and considerably sadder, a woman who had never once been required to examine why she kept doing this, to anyone, regardless of who they were. It doesn't make it hurt less that it happened to me, he said one evening over dinner that had stopped, somewhere in the last month, feeling like strategy and started feeling like something else entirely. But it helps to understand it wasn't ever really about me being replaceable. It was about her never learning there was a cost to any of it. My aunt kept her word about looking at things properly, in the slow, uneven way real change usually happens instead of the clean redemption arc television would have promised. She started, quietly, insisting on actual accountability in family conversations instead of automatic defense. Small things at first, correcting relatives who tried to minimize what had happened, eventually working up to a conversation with Sophie herself that I only heard about secondhand, apparently long and difficult, and not fully resolved even now. Sophie reached out to me herself in the 5th month, a text I read 3 times before I could decide how to feel about it. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't think I've fully figured out yet why I keep doing this, and I know that's not an excuse. I just wanted you to know I'm actually trying to understand it with an actual therapist, not just telling everyone I'm fine the way I usually do. I didn't respond right away. I sat with it for several days, turning over 9 years of accumulated hurt against the small, uncertain shape of an apology that, for the first time, didn't come wrapped in an explanation designed to make the hurt someone else's fault. I appreciate you telling me that, I wrote back eventually. I'm not ready to pretend everything's fine, but I'm glad you're actually looking at it instead of finding a new soft word for it. It wasn't reconciliation, not fully, not yet. But it was, for the first time in 9 years, an honest exchange instead of a performance either of us needed the rest of the family to witness and approve of. Marcus never married Sophie. The engagement dissolved fully within the year, quietly, without the dramatic public unraveling I think some corners of the family half expected. He reached out to me once, months later, not for anything specific, just to say that as painful as the timing had been, he was grateful he'd found out before instead of after, and that he didn't hold what I'd done against me, even if the method had been, in his words, more elaborate than most people's version of the truth usually requires. I've thought about that phrase often since. Whether the trap itself was necessary, or whether I could have found some gentler path to the same truth if I'd trusted my family to actually look for it without proof this undeniable. I don't have a fully settled answer. Some days I think 9 years of being disbelieved earned me the right to build whatever proof it finally took. Other days I wonder what it cost me, specifically, to become someone capable of building it so precisely. Julian and I are still together a year later, though neither of us talks about how we met without also talking about what it cost to get here. It isn't the tidy romantic ending some of my family, softened by time and distance from what actually happened, have started referring to it as, at least something good came out of all that mess. My mother said recently, a sentence that still makes something in my chest tighten every time I hear it, because I don't think the good was the point, and I don't think it should have needed to be. Sophie is still in therapy, still working through whatever made 9 years of taking without examining possible for her, and we speak occasionally now, careful, incomplete conversations that feel less like the family reunion everyone else seems to want, and more like 2 people slowly deciding whether trust is something that can actually be rebuilt after this much damage, or whether some things simply become a different, smaller kind of relationship instead. My aunt still calls every Sunday. The conversations are different now, less performance, more actual honesty, though I notice, even now, the old instinct occasionally rising in her to soften something before it's fully examined, and I've learned to simply name it when it happens instead of letting it slide the way I used to. I sent my cousin one photograph and watched 9 years of unexamined pattern finally collide with proof solid enough that nobody in my family could soften it into something smaller. I don't know if I'd call what happened afterward justice, exactly. I think it was something more complicated than that, the specific, unglamorous work of forcing a family to finally look directly at something they'd spent nearly a decade choosing not to see. I don't regret sending that photograph. I regret, some days, that it took 6 broken relationships and 1 elaborate trap before anyone in my family was finally willing to look. Was Daphne right to build the trap the way she did? Or did the elaborate setup go further than the situation actually called for? Comment she earned this, or too far. And her aunt. 9 years of softening the truth before finally looking at it honestly. Redeemable, or too little too late. Comment people can change or damage already done. Tell me exactly where you land. If this story had you keeping score of every excuse this family made, hit subscribe. Eternal Novel drops a new story every week, and the next one might be the one that finally breaks your heart the right way. Like this video, drop your verdict in the comments, and I'll see you in the next story.